Order. Welcome to the Treasury Select Committee on Tuesday, the 5th of November. Today, we're really pleased to welcome the Office for Budget Responsibility to give us evidence on the budget. Obviously, they're a key part of the budget process. And I'm pleased to welcome Richard Hughes, who's chair of the Office for Budget Responsibility. It really needs no introduction. He's joined, of course, by Tom Josephs, who's a member of the Budget Responsibility Committee, and by Professor David Miles, CBE, who's also a member of that committee. So we're here today to dig into the Blue Book and find out what the OBR's take is on the budget ahead of meeting the Chancellor of the Exchequer tomorrow. And of course, this afternoon we've got further witnesses as well. So delighted to welcome you. And I'm going to pass to John Glenn, MP, to kick off.
Thank you, Chair. It's a great privilege to have you here. And obviously, the OBR is a significant arbiter of truth, or is deemed to be, when we get to fiscal events. So I want to ask about GDP and how you calculate what is the expectation going forward. There's a lot of controversy around that. Now, if we look at the last 4 years since the pandemic, we've got sort of an annualised rate of about 0.6%. But recently, we've seen in the first half of this year a 2.0% annualised rate. I was just wanting to clarify, given how the OBR is markedly more optimistic typically than the Bank of England and some other forecasters, how you assess the prospects of the government coming into this fiscal event, because obviously the first half of the year is rather different and appears to show an upward trajectory. Perhaps you could start, Mr. Hughes.
Let me start, and I'm sure Professor Miles will want to come in. So, from relatively disappointing growth last year, sort of close to zero, we've actually slightly revised up our forecast for growth this year at around 1.1%. And we do think that the combination of the momentum coming into this year plus the boost given to GDP by government policies boosts that growth rate up to 2% going into next year. But that is mostly a temporary boost to output from the demand stimulus coming out of the fact that the government is increasing spending by more than taxation in this budget, and so that raises GDP by around 0.5% at its peak. But that demand effect dissipates over the remainder of the forecast, and growth dips down to around 1.5% by the time we get to the end of our forecast period. That's a bit below what is our kind of long-run assumption for the potential growth rate of the UK economy, which is around 1 2/3. But part of that below-trend growth is needed to take the sort of demand stimulus out of the economy, which we assume happens over a period of years after this year.
Can I just probe a little bit further on that? So your assessment over the forecast period is that growth will be 0.7% lower than you did in the March event. But one of the criticisms, to be fair to the government, is that they would say that some of the supply-side reforms that they envisage happening would have a positive effect over that forecast period. Can you explain to the committee why that hasn't been factored in? Is it through historic optimism of Treasury forecasts, or is there another reason? Because obviously this government made a virtue of some of those reforms and headlined on them from day one. Is that a reasonable assumption on your part?
Do you want, David? Do you want to?
Of course.
I think the main sort of pro-growth measure that will come through a little bit over the forecast horizon, but stronger outside the 5-year period because it inevitably takes time, is the fairly substantial increase in government public investment, increasing the sort of public capital stock, which takes time to come through. There's a time lag between starting projects, spending some money on them, and them actually coming on stream. Obviously, that's long with some things, building a new motorway or a road or a power station, less with other things, but on average there's a bit of a lag. So that comes through a bit by the end of the forecast horizon, but more strongly after that, assuming that the higher level of public sector investment is sustained beyond that. There's a bit of an offset to that in terms of the productive potential, which is the real driver of growth over the long term in the UK. What happens to our productive potential? There's a bit of an offset from slightly lower labour supply as a result of the national insurance measure. That's a smaller offset than the positive effect you get from a higher public sector investment. The net effect of those things is that over the forecast horizon, overall budget measures don't move the dial very much on growth. It was, we thought, before the budget measures going to be about 1.5%, 1.6% over the forecast horizon. We think it's about the same after it. But beyond that, you get the much more positive effects from the higher investment. You're right, by the way, that we are more optimistic than the Bank of England has been on the growth potential of the UK economy, and a bit more optimistic than probably most other forecasters. That's because we've taken a view that if you look back over the last 10, 12 years or so, it's been an abysmal period for productivity growth in the UK. There are some reasons for that which are beyond what's happening in the UK, COVID, the Russian invasion of the Ukraine and the knock-on effects that's had. We're not so pessimistic as to believe that the 10-year backward-looking average is what you might now expect going forward. So we've taken a view that the next 10 years from now on forward, if you will, is about halfway between the dismal last decade and the much more positive 40 years previous to that. So that's why we're a bit more optimistic than most.
Can I turn to household spending and saving in terms of the impact that has in the near term? Obviously, with what happened after COVID, savings patterns changed. Could you say something about what you think about is likely to happen with savings levels? I think there is, an indication that it might still go up as people feel insecure, and what impact that would have on growth and economic activity.
Savings rate, for reasons that are pretty easy to understand, the household saving rate became very high during COVID, and I mean to a large extent because people's ability to go out and spend money was much reduced. So no great surprise there. I think what's been surprising is that it hasn't fallen back anywhere near to the very low levels it was in the years leading up to COVID. And we thought that might happen. Turns out that hasn't happened. I mean, to some extent, but I think only a minor part of it, is that interest rates have subsequently moved up since the end of the end of COVID, since the COVID restrictions became much less severe. Interest rates on balance have moved up a bit more than people had thought. That may be a bit of a factor. I suspect a stronger one is just heightened uncertainty about what the future might bring. COVID was obviously a huge shock, and then you have the massive increase in energy prices after the Russian invasion. Our best guess, and I think it's hopefully an educated guess, but not much more than that, is that the savings rate does drop a little bit from its levels, but it doesn't get back as low as it was pre-COVID. Because consumer spending is the biggest chunk of overall spending on GDP in the economy, even relatively small changes in the savings rate can have a pretty big effect on demand in the economy.
So a slightly lower interest rate will mean people will save less, spend more, and that will be good for the economy. That's the essence of what you
I think
expect.
on balance that's probably right. Part of it just naturally runs through the mechanism of mortgage rates being a bit lower. People having more disposable income, and that being more than an offset for those people that have savings, finding they've got a bit more money because interest rates a bit less money because interest rates are lower. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Glenn. Rachel Blake wanted to come in.
Thank you very much. I was struck, Professor Miles, by what you said about government investment in response to John Glenn's question around growth. And I'm really interested to know how you have factored in the proposed planning reforms and whether or not there's any dependence of the deliverability and the market's response to those reforms to deliver on some of that growth.
Professor Miles.
No direct estimate of the impacts in our central forecast, largely because I think we're still waiting for sort of more specific detail on exactly what they imply and how that might play out. So we haven't factored in anything explicit about planning reforms boosting investment, particularly in housing, over the next 5 years. Things may become much more specific and clear on the policies over the next 6-12 months. When that's right, we'll factor something in. So I would say that there's a bit of an asymmetry in the sense that you'd have to be very pessimistic to think that whatever the plans are, they do nothing. So the chances are there'll be some upside on investment, particularly in sort of residential structures. But we haven't factored that in yet.
Okay, 1.1 then, Mr. Corbyn.
Yeah, and is that because it's very difficult to forecast and understand because of regional impacts, or is that could it be a bit of that, or is it because of the lack of detail?
It's a bit because of lack of detail. It's also because, as you rightly say, I think it's hard to know quite how effective measures will be. I mean, there's been a history in the UK, I'm sure people here are fully aware of this, of government saying, well, we're going to tweak the planning system and we're going to build more houses, and it's pretty difficult to move the dial.
Groundhog Day and answers, Mr. Hughes. And
just to add, the details at the moment are sketchy, and there are consultations ongoing. It's worth saying what details we do have are mostly about residential planning, and a lot of, if we're talking about business investment, a lot of what matters to businesses is the commercial planning regime, less the residential.
Thank you, Mr. Coughlin.
Thank you. Thank you for coming in today. I'm very interested in the fiscal stimulus that you have in these forecasts. So you have a 1% fiscal loosening, yet you've got GDP only increasing by, as you said, 0.6% and at its peak, and zero net effect over the 5 years. So why is that exactly? Because that implies that there's no real fiscal stimulus, and is that due to the quality of the multipliers that are used, or is that due to what it's been spent on? Is it going, I guess, more on salaries and less on infrastructure and very little on R&D? Or if you could talk a bit about the multipliers, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead. I'll give you a break at some point.
I'll be very brief. Thank you very much. I'll be very brief. I think the big picture answer is that the UK at the moment looks like an economy with not a whole lot of spare capacity in the economy. And the unemployment rate's pretty low. There may be some loosening in the labour market, but it's still the case that vacancies are historically quite high. A lot of surveys suggest that companies haven't got a lot of slack. So if you add some demand to the economy, which this budget clearly does, you can get a short-run impact which is meaningful, and that's what drives the growth rate up to 2%. But if you're running up against capacity limits, that's going to put a sort of natural ceiling on how much you can boost GDP until the point at which budget measures actually start increasing the productive potential of the economy. And that happens significantly outside the 5-year window rather than inside the 5-year window. So that's why it hasn't moved the dial a whole lot on growth over the forecast horizon.
We'll go on quick follow-up. Thank you. So what I don't fully understand is, therefore, because you have inflation going up by quite a lot, yet you're saying there's a lot of crowding out, and also that obviously taxes are going up significantly for the NI rise. So the tax rises are generally more recessionary in terms of impact than spending increases. So therefore, isn't there a bit of a contradiction there in terms of inflation going up so much? Spare capacity.
I mean, there's a net fiscal loosening, right? Spending is going up by twice as much as tax. So net borrowing is up by about 1% of GDP. That pushes up inflation a bit. It also pushes up our expectations for where inflation, for the path of interest rates over the forecast period. So we've added about a quarter of a percentage point to interest rates, both bank rate and gilt rates over the forecast period. That's part of what then takes some of the heat out of demand over the next 5 years and allows inflation to come back to target. So part of that crowding out is happening because it is increasing the cost of finance to businesses and households, and that's part of what helps bring demand back into line with our view of potential, which is, as David pointed out, we assume at the moment the economy is quite close to potential. So if you push the economy above that, you've got excess demand, and that creates an issue for the Bank of England in terms of having to manage that excess demand. And we think, all things being equal, that means it's going to take longer for interest rates to come back down than they would prior to this budget.
Okay, we'll come back to some of the crowding out issues in a moment. I'm going to now ask Dame Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Chair. And a question for Richard Hughes, if I may. You start your report by saying that the economic and fiscal backdrop since March is broadly unchanged. The budget itself creates an enormous £350 billion increase in public spending. I mean, you're the Office for Budget Responsibility. Is that responsible?
So it is a loosening of fiscal policy, and I guess there are three ways to look at the sort of risks around this particular set of policy decisions. I think you can look at what's happening on spending, you can look at what's happening on tax, and you can look at what's happening to borrowing and debt overall. On the tax side, about half of the tax rises, I think in our view are relatively certain and reliable. I mean, putting up national insurance is a very reliable tax. It's a tax on payrolls. You raise it, you will bring in the revenues. Tom will talk more about this, or Mr. Joseph will talk more about this. But the other half of the tax yield is based on raising taxes on a relatively small number of individuals, for which the revenues are quite uncertain, because it depends on how they respond. So on the tax side, there are some risks around the yield that you might get from the receipts. On the spending side, there is a big increase in public spending, 2% of GDP, about £70 billion. It is very front-loaded in its profile, so there is lots of extra resources being provided to government departments this year and next. But then the profile of that spending slows quite dramatically, from over 4% this year down to 3% next year, then down to 1.3%. The deliverability of that profile, I think, poses challenges.
Colleagues will want to ask a bit more about some of those aspects later on, but I wanted to just ask about the impact on interest rates. So you've said in your report that you've raised permanently the interest rate by a quarter as a result of the measures taken in the budget. How sensitive is the UK economy now to additional shocks in terms of interest rates?
I mean, clearly much more sensitive now that we've got 100%.
Number on it.
So
1% move in interest rates that's not anticipated in your projections. How sensitive would that make the UK economy?
I think around a 1 percentage point increase in interest rates. Colleagues may help me, but it is.
In terms of the impact on the fiscal position, we have various scenario analysis and sensitivity analysis in the EFO. So I think it's roughly a 1 percentage point increase in interest rates adds about 16 billion or so to borrowing.
Entire headroom, basically.
Well, actually, I think in terms of looking at headroom against the current budget, which is about 10 billion, we have some sensitivity analysis which I think says you just need a change in the effective interest rate of about 0.3, 30 basis points.
So just to be clear, so 0.3% change would wipe out the headroom.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Chris Coughlin, did you want to come in and brief on this?
Yeah, so just correcting that. I thought it was 1.3% that would wipe out the.
There's a difference. There's a number of different sort of analysis in the book on the impact of interest rates on the fiscal position. We do have a sort of full scenario where we look at, as you say, a 1.3% increase in the interest rate and kind of run that fully through the model.
Right.
And that actually results in the current balance in 5 years being in deficit by 11 billion. So you're actually missing the rule by 11 billion. The sensitivity analysis that I was talking about previously just looks at what you would need to get the current balance down to essentially zero, so to take away all the current headroom, and we have 0.3.
Great. And just to follow up on Harriet's point, how worried are you about this? 'Cause obviously, I think gilt yields went up by 10 basis points on Friday. In the mini budget, they went up 40 basis points. I think that's the highest ex the mini budget. I think that's the largest increase in gilt yield we've seen from any budget for many years. And related, the other thing I'm worried about is I think I saw that there's 22 billion of extra borrowing just from the result of inflation-linked gilts in government debt. And given that the extra spending is only 30 billion, that seems highly material to me in terms of the overall risk profile of the UK fiscal position.
We expected the budget to be a surprise to the markets just in terms of the volume of gilt issuance, and so to a large extent the gilt market response was just a response to higher volumes. So if there are more gilts on the market, that drives down the price. And I think to some extent also the front loading of the expenditure was also a surprise to the markets, and so just the volume that the market was being asked to take down this year and next was more than they expected. We had expected the gilt marks to be a bit surprised. That's why we added in the extra 0.25 percentage point. Where gilt yields are settled down, I would say are broadly in line with that expectation, maybe a little bit above, but not significantly.
Thank you very much. Yuan Young, MP.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the whole panel for your immense work on this outlook. So, Mr. Hughes, I want to get into this question about spare capacity in the economy and your assumption that there is very little spare capacity left. I wonder if the OBR has been overly pessimistic about the idea that the UK economy is operating at full potential, because you previously write that there'd been a scarring effect of the pandemic on potential output due to factors including a loss of skills and increases in labour market inactivity, and of course the data shows that our workforce has shrunk since the pandemic. In fact, more than any other rich economy's workforce has shrunk since 2020. So my question is that if the origin of this economic scarring lies in a health crisis, to what extent do you think the government can heal this scarring? And if it can, in fact, heal the scarring, have you been a bit too pessimistic about the potential for more labour market activity?
So my colleagues will definitely have thoughts to provide as well, but I would say there's a distinction between sort of untapped potential and spare capacity in the economy. And when you look at most of the indicators of spare capacity in the UK, meaning is there ready capacity being underutilised at this point in time, which firms can draw on, unemployment is close to what most people think is its sort of structural rate, around in sort of low 4%. Capacity utilisation in businesses is pretty high. You've seen high numbers of vacancies relative to job seekers. So all those things point to the fact that in terms of a labour force that is readily deployable into a set of jobs within the next few months, all those things look quite close to there being a relatively small output gap. But it is also true that the participation rate in the UK economy has fallen dramatically since the pandemic. But quite a lot of those people are out of work for health reasons. They are likely to require some kind of health interventions and employment support to get them back into the labour force. The previous government had announced, and the current government is considering further measures to act on that group. But one thing that we know about that group is that you do require interventions and you do require time to bring them into the labour force. When they do come back into the labour force, they don't always work full time, and they don't always stay in employment for long periods. And so it is not akin to sort of traditional unemployment where somebody has lost their job, they're looking for a job. When they find one, they will quickly be back working full time and at a full wage. And so to that extent, yes, there is untapped potential in the labour force. There are people outside the workforce for health reasons. Whether that's something which, given the government is spending a lot of money now, whether that is a readily available labour supply that could respond to that and meet the needs of the government, which is in the sectors of healthcare, education, highly trained professional jobs, was not clear to us, and suggests that that is going to put some inflationary pressure on the economy.
And similarly to following on from Rachel Blake's question about planning reform, is the reason that you haven't yet modelled the impacts of that health and social care investment due to a lack of detail, or is it simply that it's quite an unprecedented situation that we're in post-pandemic and therefore you don't really know, based on previous evidence, what the impact might be on labour market inactivity?
I guess we were saying a few things. One is that we do actually model the impact of public investment on potential output, and for the first time we've actually incorporated estimates of the return on that, the long run return on that investment for the potential output of the UK. The issue is just the time lags are very long, right? It takes a long time to build a new hospital, it takes a long time to build a new railway. So within a 5-year forecast horizon, you see a relatively modest impact, but some impact, 0.1% on the level of potential output. That boosts the capital stock of the UK economy in the long run by a lot more, but it takes time. There is also potential for sort of spending in general on healthcare, spent in the right places and in the right way, to provide some of that support that people need to get back into the labour force, if that spending is targeted on the particular difficulties and health problems that group of people have. We did some work in our fiscal risks report over the summer, which looked at what are the potential returns on those kind of investments, and they are huge. If you can keep people healthier for longer and stay in the labour force, you're talking about tens of percentage points on the level of government debt in higher tax revenues, lower benefits. lowest paying on benefits, less pressure on the health service. But again, it takes a long time for those benefits to be realised, because it can take several years to get people back into the labour force. It takes several years for the long-term benefits from that to come through taxation, and ultimately the pressures they put on the health service sort of not to materialise. So you can see modest differences over a 5-year forecast. We've done that in previous forecasts when the government announced some welfare to work measures. But so far, what governments have done is relatively modest, even in the near term, and the benefits take quite a long time to materialise.
And one final question on this, and you talk about the indicators of unemployment. So how confident are you in the jobs market data, given that the ONS has paused publication of the labour force survey for about a year? We've had declining responses to the survey. People don't seem to want to fill it out. And the Bank of England and the Low Pay Commission are now using alternative sources of data, but those alternative sources sometimes point in different directions. So how confident are you about the picture that you have on the labour market?
Professor Miles.
Not very. For the reasons you said. I mean, the response rate to the labour force surveys fell really sharply, and we thought that was maybe largely to do with COVID, but it hasn't really come back. And so the reliability of that data really has fallen a lot. I mean, the ONS is doing something about it, but it takes time, and right now I think there's still a big question mark about that. I mean, we have some other indicators which are not the labour force survey. So you can ask firms, are you finding it difficult to hire people? And I feel some confidence in the view that the labour market is relatively tight. Vacancies data is pretty reliable. That doesn't depend on the labour force survey. That's still at quite a high level, though it's falling, the number of vacancies. So I think the judgment that there isn't a whole lot of spare capacity in the UK labour market right now looks a reasonable one.
This idea that there's short-term tightness, there's medium-term kind of uncertainty depending on how many people can come back into work.
Yes.
And what's the kind of time frame for those two time runs?
Well, I think it goes back to your question about health, which, I mean, for example, on waiting lists, I mean, if waiting lists were to come down substantially over the next 3 or 4 years, you'd expect that to have some impact. I think it might be limited, though, even over a 3, 4, 5 year time horizon, partly because I would imagine that in the health service, the priority would be given to people who are in real distress and in real pain, many of whom may be over 60 years of age. You do an enormous amount of good by getting those people off the waiting list and helping them, but you might not get much payback in terms of, well, they're going to now rejoin the labour force. I mean, somebody needs a hip replacement and they're 60 years of age, probably not going back into the labour force.
Very quickly on the confidence in the data, obviously this is a tremendous amount of work in the economic outlook. Is there an argument for there to be more caveating or confidence intervals of the projections you present, given the lack of confidence that we've just described in the data inputs?
Well, I love caveats, but it comes across as so defensive. You just keep saying, this is a central estimate, it's guaranteed to be wrong, we're not sure in which direction it's going to be wrong. But all those things are true.
And I mean, one of the reasons why it is so long is because it is so full of caveats and scenarios. We do try and, we've got swathes around our GDP forecasts, swathes around our inflation forecasts. Markets themselves give you different reads on interest rates almost every day. We also try and do scenarios partly to illustrate the uncertainty around our central forecasts, but also just to illustrate kind of what matters and what difference it makes if we're getting it wrong in one direction or another. So that includes we've done scenarios around what the potential output effect of public investment might be, which range quite widely depending on whether you believe it crowds in or crowds out private investment. We have to have a central forecast because we have to tell the government whether they're on track to meet their fiscal rules, but we also try and emphasise every time that there's a huge amount of uncertainty around those forecasts and governments need to manage the public finances accordingly.
Thank you. Dr. Jeevan Sandram.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming this morning, panel. I really appreciate as well indeed the work of the OBR. I want to pick up on some of the stuff around health. Is it fair to say, in your judgment, potential output is limited because of, in part, the state of our NHS, the highest waiting list in history? A simple yes or no is fine.
So it's certainly people being out of work for health reasons is accounting for hundreds of thousands of people lost from the labour force since pre-pandemic. The issue around the waiting list is that most people on the waiting list are not those people. They are people who are older, have left the labour force or weren't working, or who are still working, and are just waiting for healthcare. So, addressing the waiting list may have some impact on that group. But as David was saying, the majority of the people on the waiting list are older people who are not in the workforce anyway, or people who are already working.
More broadly, the state of public health. We're the only OECD nation to see sickness rise after the pandemic. So something about public health is going wrong, I think it's fair to say. And would that be fair to say, in your judgment, that is limiting potential output, especially within the near term, but just where we are today?
Certainly, and it's a mixture of both. We've seen some improvements in physical health, but also some deteriorations in others. And then the fastest growing health problem is mental health, and that's the fastest growing reason people cite, and now the most common reason people cite for being out of the labour force for health reasons.
Yeah, so public health in general leading to a reduction, how well we are moving forward. I want to think back previously to some of your forecasts. I think this isn't just about public health cuts, but other cuts that lead to deterioration in health. How did cuts in the public sector in general, what public health in particular, was cut by a third since 2015? How has that figured or factored into your previous forecast of potential output?
So I guess it's worth saying a few things. One is that we have only recently started doing a sort of bottom-up assessment of the potential output of the UK economy and made it explicitly responsive to individual government policy measures. We started doing that about 2 years ago. We've been slowly building up our ability to do that, primarily thanks to what the ONS have been able to provide us about the drivers of potential output, about the labour supply, about the capital stock, about productivity. Work that we've done has given us a better understanding of the links between government policy and those components, but it is by no means easy to assess in a straightforward way what's the impact of what happens in the health service, what happens to the health of the nation, and then what happens to the labour supply. That is a very long train of causality. Each step of which is I think not well understood in this country.
I appreciate it's difficult. The thing I'm concerned about are what's happened previously in terms of cuts and your outturn data, and then you not shifting the forecast. I'm looking here at, I think, chart 4.5 of your old potential output data. I know I don't expect you to go into every single chart of every single publication you've had, but what I see is potential output estimates being very invariant over the past decade. What I've also seen is a lot of public sector cuts now damaging public health, and now in your estimate damaging potential output. And so what I'm concerned about with this budget is the increase in health expenditure are not in your estimate leading to increase in potential output, but it seems you've also been invariant to public sector cuts over the past decade. Do you see my concern?
Mr. Hughes.
Myself and my predecessors have revised down our views of potential output pretty steadily since the aftermath of the financial crisis. Every country in the world has suffered a big hit to potential output, including those like the US who've continued to spend lots and lots of money on healthcare. So the idea that there's a direct one-for-one link between how much you're spending on healthcare and the potential output of the country, I don't think is demonstrated by the data. Lots of different factors have fed into the UK's poor potential output performance over the last decade and a half. Part of it has been the sectoral composition of our economy. Part of it has been something which the world has faced, which has been a slowdown in technological innovation and its impact on the growth potential of all of our economies. Whether you can directly link that as an economist, doing a forecast to specific decisions made by specific governments to spend money in particular areas is difficult. In this forecast, what have we seen? A big increase in government spending this year and next on healthcare, mostly to address, to get through backlogs in the health service and other kinds of services. But then we know very little about what the government's plans are for healthcare spending after that. So we have nothing on which to base any kind of assessment of the impact of any of the government spending plans beyond next year on what it does to the economy. All we have is one number for current spending and one number for capital spending.
And if I may, Mr. Hughes, I don't think it's just about public health cuts. I think it's about more general public sector output, or rather the impact of public sector cuts since 2010. I would also say I don't think the American healthcare expenditure statistics are particularly instructive given their own kind of healthcare system compared to our own. I want to pick up something that Professor Miles, you said. You talked about the assumptions you're using about public investment multipliers over the next 5 years. In fact, you said it was inevitable. I'm interested that you're using an assumption rather than outturn data. I'm particularly interested in this. The United States has grown faster than its potential output forecast since 2021. It's about 2% larger. Unemployment's at 4% there, inflation's at 2.4%. It's growing quite rapidly from an increase in public investment. It appears that it's having effects within 5 years. Where did the real world outturn data of the United States factor into your forecast and how you're constructing them?
Well, yeah, I mean, the forecast of what the impact of public sector capital spending has draws upon a kind of quite big empirical literature across lots of different countries as to what's the rate of return on public sector capital spending on things like infrastructure. So we used estimates based on a range of these studies from a lot of countries, actually disproportionately they're US studies because that's the nature of the academic world. People do research on the US more than any other country. And they really fed into our assessment about what higher public sector capital spending is going to do to the protective potential of the UK. The reason it can look a bit disappointing over the forecast horizon is partly, but not the main reason, that the big increase in government spending is a little bit more on current spending in the near term than it is on capital spending. But the bigger reason is there's just a time lag.
Professor Miles, I respect that wasn't the question I asked. The question that I asked was, the United States has invested a lot of money since the pandemic, is growing faster than potential output. I appreciate the empirical exercises, but also I would say two things about that. One of which is empirical exercises over decades past may not be very instructive in the post-COVID data. I'm saying that outturn data where we are today. So my specific question is, around the outturn data, the United States, a huge increase in public investment leading to a huge increase in growth, faster than potential output forecast in 2021. Did that figure into the way you're forecasting potential output within the UK?
Right. Well, there's a bunch of reasons why the US might be different from the UK. Higher public sector investment would be one of them, but I think there's a bunch of other factors going on there. Our assessment of what public sector capital spending does to the productive potential of the UK, because it draws on all these different studies, is going to be about the average of all the countries that were looked at in the studies, which were disproportionately the US.
And if I can just add, it's worth having a look at the paper we published over the summer, which I think is probably the most exhaustive piece of work on this question that there is out there in the world. And one of the people that we talked to in putting it together was the Congressional Budget Office in the US, and said to them, basically, put them exactly this question, which is how would you assess the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act in the US on the potential output of the US economy? And they'd come up with almost exactly the same numbers as we have, in fact slightly lower in terms of their impact, what they think the impact of those measures are going to be on the US economy. So we have very explicitly talked to our American colleagues about this and come to something of a meeting of minds. If anything, we think that the government's measures here are going to have a slightly bigger effect than they thought in the US.
Thank you very much. Lucy Rigby, MP.
Thank you, Chair. I'm conscious that you've extended your forecast out to the 10-year and the 50-year period. And I'm also conscious, Professor Miles, you mentioned the time lags, which I want to dig into in a second. But first of all, and I'm conscious as well of the note in your report about the new draft Charter for Budget Responsibility. But do you think the fact of looking at a longer-term forecast, a longer-term horizon, incentivises longer-term investment strategies?
I think we hope so. And it's certainly, it's been a sort of abiding philosophy of ours that you have to look over a number of different time horizons to answer different questions. And definitely when you're getting into these questions of how can the government move the dial on a whole set of structural challenges that the UK economy faces, be it long-term sickness, be it underinvestment either in the public sector or in the private sector, how can you demonstrate the return on those kind of policy interventions when you've got huge time lags to help people, huge time lags between spending money, getting shovels in the ground, getting a railway built and getting trains running on it. And you just have to look beyond the 5-year horizon. I think the longest we do is a 50-year forecast. And so you will see on this committee next summer, and hopefully we'll come and talk to you about it, our next fiscal risks and sustainability report, which does 50-year projections for the public finances. And there you really see the difference that different kinds of policy choices can make, for better or for worse, I would say, on fiscal sustainability. What we've also tried to do also in our economic and fiscal outlooks is where we think there are policy measures where the medium-term effect of policy changes is materially different from the near-term effect, to try and quantify that and show that. As David was saying, we did that on the public investment measures, and you can see over time the effects of those things building up, all the way to 1.4% of extra GDP in 50 years' time, and then building up from just the 0.14% that you get at the end of the 5-year forecast horizon. And but those are the time horizons you're talking about with public investments, right? It takes a long time to get a return on those things. I mean, there are also things on the downside, right? There are also parts of the public finances where you look beyond the medium term and you start to worry. One is the trajectory of health spending, which just goes up and up and up. And growing faster than the economy consistently over time, and the other is trajectories for revenues. Fuel duty is the most evident one, which which stands out when you look 50 years ahead, which is fuel duty revenues in this country are headed to zero, and that's around 1% of GDP worth of tax revenue. So if people didn't like the tax rises that they've seen recently, well, you're about to see that amount of tax revenue disappear from fuel duty over the next 50 years.
And on those time lags, I think you're obviously assuming a decent amount of time there. How confident are you about the evidence for those time lags?
I mean, we try and draw it from the best empirical literature that you can find. Obviously, to assess impacts over 50 years, you have to wait 50 years. And so a lot of these studies are looking at the impact of, as David was saying, federal government investment in the US in the 1950s and 60s, the sort of federal highway system. And one of the things which we have worried about is the fact that building a highway system from scratch gives you a big investment return. Fixing the one you've already got probably delivers something slightly less. So you also have to aim off from the fact that when you're looking at mature advanced economies with established infrastructure networks and you're just kind of patching them up and fixing them and building some extra capacity there, you're not going to get anything like the big return you get from building a port for the first time, building an airport for the first time, putting in a highway system for the first time. We try to make some adjustments for those things and come up with what is a central estimate of what the likely return on economic return from those interventions is going to be.
And one more question, if I may, Chair. It's just on the dynamic scoring. How do you choose which policies are within scope from a scoring point of view?
So we set out a set of criteria about maybe it was 2 years ago, in the summer of 2022, to answer this precise question, which is that where we see policies which we think are going to have a material, evidence-based, additional, and there was one other word which I've forgotten, but it's in the paper, impact on the supply side of the economy, then we would take it into account. Because obviously every policy might have some small effect, but it's really only the ones that the most important ones are material and additional. Is it a big effect, and also is it something different which you wouldn't otherwise get from just government business as usual? So is government doing something which is going to make a difference to just kind of standard tax and spending?
And do you think government might be incentivised to go for policies which you're more likely to score?
I think we'll see. So far, I would say in the last few budgets, you've seen a handful of policies that meet those kind of criteria and where we've applied supply side effects. I mean, to be honest, the impacts are relatively modest because the policies have been relatively modest, and also we're looking over a relatively short time horizon. So you don't see a big difference from any kind of policy intervention over 5 years. And also the sorts of things which they have done on things like welfare to work and even on public investment. We've gone from public investment has been raised by about £20 billion. That is a significant amount of money, but all it really does is hold the level of public investment flat as a share of GDP compared to where it is now, rather than falling down to 1.7. So it makes a bit of a difference, but it's by international standards, it's still a relatively modest amount of public investment.
Thank you. Dr. Sander.
Thank you. I want to talk a little bit about the way you've been forecasting things over the past 14 years, what it might mean for today. In productivity, between 2010 and 2012, you were saying productivity would hit 2.5%. In 2015, you said about 2%, and now your forecast pulling out to 1.5%. Really, in that time, productivity hasn't really exceeded 1%. Is it fair to say your forecasts were missing something?
I was fair to say they're wrong. What we were, early on, when the OBR was first established, I think like a lot of economists, we thought that the financial crisis in 2008 was going to be tough, but basically all our economies were going to bounce back to something that looked similar to pre-financial crisis normality, and that productivity growth would just return to its previous trends. It just didn't. And then I think you had 5 to 10 years of economists living in hope that at some point, once people got their balance sheet sorted out, and once the structural changes in our economies happened that needed to happen, then they would return to those levels of productivity. More recently, we and other forecasts have just been downgrading our view of the long run output for productivity and potential. As David was saying, we've ended up somewhere between pre-financial crisis highs and post-financial crisis sort of dismal performance, somewhere in between, but it's a number which we keep under review every time we put a forecast together.
And I would just say, of course, we will have the Office of Budget Responsibility in front of us many times over the next year to discuss how they work, and I think we can focus on the budget, particularly with the Chancellor coming in front of us. That will be helpful.
And I think the thing here is kind of what this means for stuff going forward, right? Because basically your investment multipliers at the moment, they're about 1, they decay to 0 by the end of the forecast period. The IMF has it at about 1.4. Other studies have it at much higher. Are you worried that your multiplier estimate has been wrong, is wrong today, has been wrong in the past? I.e. the mistake you're making in 2010 is where you are today?
I'm pretty satisfied that the estimates we have for the long run return from public investment on potential output is central and in line with the evidence. You need to be a little bit careful when you look at IMF and World Bank studies, because they tend to look at a broad range of advanced emerging market and developing countries when they estimate their returns on public investment. And it is a world away investing in infrastructure in a country like the UK, which has got 6 airports around London, a motorway system, a mature transport network, and you're trying to improve the operation of that network, and an emerging market or developing country where you're putting those things in place for the first time. There is no doubt that in those kind of countries, investments in infrastructure deliver a huge economic return because they connect the country up to a global economy that it wasn't previously connected to. In the UK, that's not the situation we're in. We're trying to make an existing network that's already connected us to the outside world and to ourselves function a bit more efficiently. And that's a different proposition from the kind of multipliers that you get from papers that the IMF produce.
In the long term, I have one more question. Can I put forward a story to you, right? If you've been underestimating the public spending changes since 2010, that would lead to lower than predicted productivity, it would lead to the higher borrowing and stuff that we've seen. Actually, there is a good story or a good question in terms of what's happening in the forecast, that the underestimate of public spending changes, the impact on growth, is something you might be doing today over the next 5 years with this budget as well.
I guess what public spending changes are you referring to?
I think the whole
health spending?
I think health. I mean, look. All the public spending that impacts health is broad, right? It's not just about health, it's about all the rest of your current spending. And so you're right about the bottom-up thing, right? It's really hard to estimate each individual bit of spending, but the overall impact of those public spending changes clearly had an impact on our health today. So similarly, there's an increase in public spending changes now, and you're underestimating it. Are you worried about that happening now? In a way, it could have been happening since 2010.
I suppose I worry about all sorts of things. If you just look at health spending, we've gone from being the lowest health spender in the OECD to the 6th highest out of 19 countries. So health spending in this country has been rising faster than it has in most other countries as share of GDP. So at least in the health sector, I think there is a lot of evidence for the fact that health, spending on health has been behind our international partners or somehow a drag on growth. And then I think it is also difficult to draw a one-for-one connection between spending on particular public services and the potential output of the economy.
Thank you very much. John Glenn MP.
Yes, I'd like to turn to the dynamics with the Treasury. And until, I must declare an interest, until a year ago I was Chief Secretary. Before that I had some other involvement in the Treasury. But clearly you're all set up to be, as I said at the start of my first set of questions, a dispassionate assessment of what is true. And you provide, at times, challenge to what ministers of all parties will want to do or assert will be the outcome of their decisions. Could you describe the typical rhythm of your interactions with Treasury officials between fiscal events?
Tom,
Mr.
do you want to go that?
Sure, yeah. So, essentially, the forecast is produced on a kind of iterative basis. So, right at the start of the process, we produce our first economy forecast.
When the date of the budget is declared?
Yeah, so the date of the budget is declared, typically we're given 10 weeks notice of that. And at that point we produce our first economy forecast. That economy forecast is sent to both the Treasury and also the departments that we work with to produce the fiscal forecast. So in particular, HMRC, who produce much of the tax forecast, DWP do a lot of the welfare forecast, but other departments as well. They use that economy forecast, they input that into their models, they produce their fiscal forecasts on a very bottom-up basis, so forecast for each tax stream, each spending stream. And then we have a process where we, in the OBR, essentially scrutinise all those forecasts, have discussions with the departments and the officials, and we have the right, and we typically do, make changes to those forecasts and take key judgments that will drive the final forecasts. So that's the sort of fiscal forecast part of it, and that iterates on until we produce the final forecast at budget day. And then there's the sort of policy side of it, where the Treasury will typically, after they've seen our initial forecasts, start to then consider the policies that they're going to announce at the budget. And we have a similar process whereby HMRC, DWP, Treasury will produce an initial estimate of the costs of the individual policies. They come to us, again, we scrutinise them. We will very often ask them to make changes until we're satisfied that the policy costings are central, and then we incorporate them into our forecast and produce what we call the sort of post-measures forecast, which essentially incorporates the impacts of government policy.
That was completely aligned to my understanding and experience. But what I want to move you on to is to talk about the situation between fiscal events, before that moment is triggered. And, my experience as Chief Secretary was that we were always carrying a set of notional pressures across a range of departments, and they informed the dialogue between a Chief Secretary and a departmental spending minister and their respective officials. But there was no OBR involvement in that day-to-day process of government. That is correct, isn't it?
That's right.
Yeah. So this assertion...
I would say to a limited extent.
Yeah.
I mean, to some extent, I would say. But we'll come on to this.
I'm not trying to... I'm just trying to establish... Sure. I have a lot of respect for the dynamic between the Treasury and the OBR. What I'm trying to get at is how we've got into a situation where an assertion is made on the 29th of July about a black hole, which I would acknowledge is an ongoing tension that would crystallise at a fiscal event through the process that Mr. Joseph has just described. So I just want to determine what you think about that assertion when there was no OBR involvement prior to the fiscal event date budget being triggered.
We had built up a way of working with the Treasury, and we're going to get into the weeds, unfortunately, a bit on how forecasts are put together, but in particular on departmental expenditure limits, which is the 40% of public spending which is allocated out to departments, where which had worked well up until, I would say, this past year, where within periods covered by spending of use, which deals were set by departments, there was a system of expenditure control in place, which where we had a kind of high trust relationship with the Treasury, that those things were being well managed and managed within the total. That system very clearly broke down, and when the information that came to light was presented to Parliament in July, we immediately wrote to the committee to say we were going to look into this, because we were not aware of the pressures that had been highlighted. We did our own investigation, overseen by our own non-executive directors, and asked the Treasury the specific question, what were you aware about in terms of departmental pressures? At the time, we were putting together the March budget, which was earlier in time than the July statement, about spending about pressures on departmental spending. And the short answer was that there were about £9.5 billion worth of net pressure on departments' budgets, which they did not disclose to us as part of our usual budget preparation process around DEL, which under the law and under the Act they should have done. We have written to the committee with the findings of that review, and we have also, together with the Treasury, I think, put in place a better process, and one which I think gives us greater confidence, and I hope will give this committee greater confidence that in future that kind of failure will not happen again, and that the scrutiny of and it will involve greater scrutiny on our part of departmental expenditure limits and the preparation of departments' budgets to make sure that those kind of pressures do get disclosed to us, and if they are disclosed to us, we have a conversation about how they're going to be managed, how they're going to be offset. What does that mean for net overspending or underspending against departmental expenditure?
I mean, the point I'm making is that as a minister, one receives figures from the Treasury officials and is aware of those tensions. The interaction between you, your officials, and Treasury officials is out with the relationship between ministers. So this is essentially, as you've described, a dysfunction in the smoothness of the dynamic between the Treasury and the OBR. And what you're saying is that you think that will be fixed going forward.
So, the focus of this review and the focus of its recommendations are about the institutional relationship between the OBR and the Treasury. What goes on inside the Treasury is you'll have the Treasury in front of you, so you can ask them.
Yes, we will.
What the recommendations that we make here are about the exchange of information between the OBR and the Treasury, and the way I would characterise it is that we are moving from a system of trust to a system of trust but verify, which is that they've got a set of budgets. But we want to know more about what the pressures on those budgets are. We want to know more about how much of the reserve has been committed at the start of a fiscal year, how much of it is left to deal with genuine contingencies. We want to know what decisions made about pay imply for pressures on departmental budgets and growth in those thereafter, to make sure that we're satisfied that what happened, the failure of oversight that very clearly happened back in March doesn't happen again.
Can I just ask you one other thing about the interaction with the Treasury? I recall in previous fiscal events there was an iterative process of discussion, for example, around the therapeutic effect, if you like, of the childcare policy, and during that conversation the impact on jobs, etc., worked through. So can you just describe how you are not my assumption is that you're not sort of doing this in an ivory tower, that there is an iterative process, and the insistence of a politician and a democratically elected minister, if you like, to assert things does interact with your process. So, I mean, what I'm trying to get at is that I think you were unfairly vilified by previous chancellors and prime ministers of my party, and for that is highly regrettable in my personal view. But I think in order for you to have credibility going forward, it would be good to establish that you are subject to oversight and sort of input from politicians who can make assertions in policy, and you're not beyond challenge on that.
Of course, I mean, we come before this committee to answer to your oversight. And we have to reflect the cost of government policy as we understand it and as explained to us in our forecasts. But we rely on the Treasury to be forthcoming about their best estimates of the cost of government policies and the risks around those. And in this case, that does not appear to have happened.
Don't you think it's highly regrettable over the last few months that you've been sucked into this political debate about a black hole? And do you think that can be avoided in future?
I think what happened was regrettable, because it meant that there was a serious overspend against our forecast. We've needed to make serious adjustments to that. Governments have had to make serious adjustments to policy. So I think the situation that happened was regrettable. We don't have the luxury of standing on the sidelines in these things. We have to do a forecast for departmental expenditure, and if there are errors and if there's undisclosed information, we have to correct for that, and we have to explain ourselves, which is why we did this review, which is why it was overseen by our non-executive directors, and which is why we submitted it to the committee as soon as it was done.
It's just that the problem that we've got, and we're left with, and I'll finish on this question, is that the sort of assertion is made by the government that there was a sort of willful restriction on what was shared with you. And my impression working through, I think, 7 fiscal events was that there was a formal iterative process that Mr. Joseph described, where ministers relied on their officials to share whatever you requested. And therefore I find it very hard to understand how that happened, given the integrity of Treasury officials.
We rely on the Treasury. That iterative discussion has to start on the basis of disclosure of information that the Treasury knows at the time about what's happening within departmental budgets and the pressures upon those budgets. That information was not shared with us at the time of the March budget, and it was information that was available to the Treasury at the time. Why that was the case?
We have the Permanent Secretary in front of us tomorrow, indeed.
Thank you very much.
So maybe Siobhan McDonald, Dame Siobhan McDonald.
Yeah, just as a layperson's kind of questions on from John is, it just seems amazing to me that there can be something obvious like the compensation due to sub-postmasters or the compensation for people with the contaminated blood victims.
If I may, as the minister who did that, we concluded that the day before the election was called. It's impossible.
But how that could not be included. And the other thing that I find quite interesting, given our discussions with the former Chancellor about childcare, how can it be that the current government had to put in an extra £1.6 billion to meet the upcoming changes to the childcare policies brought in by the former government? Surely if you come up with a policy, you have to cost it and you have to put it...
Well, let's see if Ms Hughes can...
On the compensation schemes for infected blood and post office, they were highlighted in our report in March as risks to the forecast, but ones that we were not able to score at that point because the final details of the compensation schemes had not been announced. And in order to be able to put things into our forecast
that
with
might have been
precision,
because they didn't want to put how much it was going to cost in.
Well, I think Mr Joseph can't speculate on what I've gone inside the Treasury. Mr Joseph.
I mean, essentially, in order for us to be able to put policies in our forecast, we have to be able to cost them with reasonable certainty, and there wasn't sufficient detail before the election, in March, I should say, to allow us to do that. We have now put the cost in the forecast because the final details of those schemes have now been announced. We're able to have discussions with the bodies that are running the schemes and agree on what a kind of central estimate of the costs will be. There's still quite a lot of uncertainty around that in terms of things like the degree to which there'll be take-up of the schemes and the average payments and the timescale over which the schemes will run, but we did feel that we had enough certainty to put numbers in the forecast.
And childcare?
So on the childcare measure, I mean, that was one that we included in the, I think it was last autumn forecast initially. There have been some changes to our estimates of the costs over time. We have in particular on that one been looking at whether delivery is on track, and we have an assessment in this latest report on that, where we essentially conclude that the kind of first phase of delivery of that programme looks on track, but there's still quite a lot of risk around the subsequent phases, so we'll continue to monitor that.
Thank you. Can I just, you said something along the lines, Mr Hughes, of departmental spending controls, I paraphrase, of HMT broken down. Obviously, there was no spending review for it was the bad rollovers, which are always a challenge. Was that, do you think, one of the reasons that there was a problem with the money, the information you were being given? Or am I asking you to speculate?
I think it's been a general problem of trying to put together a forecast for departmental spending, which is, as the spending review horizon shrinks, more and more of our forecast is just not supported by a detailed set of plans. But I mean, it is important to point out that the failing that happened here was for 2020, this financial year, which is still covered by the previous spending review. One thing which contributed to it, certainly, was the fact that those spending plans were put together at a time when everyone was expecting quite relatively modest rates of inflation. We then had a Ukraine war, big rise in energy costs, big rise in inflation, and those budgets were not, generally speaking, adjusted for that higher inflation. That put huge volume pressures on those budgets.
The pay and pension changes.
Yeah, pay and pension changes, for which some budgets were adjusted, others weren't. And so part of that net pressure which built up was sort of pay and prices pressure on various departments.
Why I asked the question is, I mean, I previously chaired the Public Accounts Committee. We could see these pressures every time we looked at a department. We were doing 2 different departments a week, pretty much. So if it could be seen in the accounts or in the pressures on a particular area of spending, was the Treasury not seeing it? Were you not seeing it? Where was the gap? Where was the problem? Where was the challenge?
I mean, the gap was partly not coming forward with us taking us through what the net pressures on departments were. Part of it is, look, we've got 50 people in our organisation. We've got to cover £1 trillion worth of public spending, £3 trillion worth of debt. You've got to deploy your resources where you think the risks lie. Heretofore, the risks on the public finances didn't really lie within Dell because the Treasury managed Dell like nobody's business, down to a few billion a year overspending here or there. It's unusual to see that level of net pressure building up, but taking into account much higher inflation, unchanged budgets, some of the other volume pressures that we're hitting some key services, that's where these things materialised.
Okay, well, I think we've got plenty of questions for the Treasury when they're in front of us. It's going to be a lively discussion, I think. Bobby Dean, MP, over to you.
I want to move on to your modelling of the government's changes to national insurance contributions. We spoke about the sort of labour market uncertainties a bit earlier on, and it kind of relates to that, really. You've got static yield changing really significantly over the course of the forecast period. How confident are you in that modelling, particularly large amount of effect being down to sort of lower wages in the labour market?
What we've done there is rely on, I think, a pretty well established way of thinking about how a tax change is allocated between a tax change which in legal terms just falls upon companies as the employer. But the economic question is, well, but where is the real incidence of the pain, if you will, from higher taxes? And that analysis depends on how sensitive is the demand for labour to changes in the cost to the employer, and how sensitive is the supply of labour to any erosion in real after-tax wages that people receive. And that's kind of been in place, that kind of analysis, that structure of thinking it through for several decades now. We apply that. What that throws out is an estimate that in the long run anyway, the majority of the impact shows up in lower real wages than they otherwise would have been. It generates a number of about 75%, 3/4 of it ends up, not in the short run, but in the longer term, falling on workers, real wages lower than they otherwise would have been, and about 1/4 of it is lower profits. So nobody escapes completely, but more of it falls upon workers in terms of lower real wages than lower profits. In the short run, it's a bit different, because the way I think it's plausible to envisage how this plays out is not that companies, on the day that the employer NICS rate goes up, say to the workforce, well, you're going to take a pay cut now. It's not going to work out that way. It's going to be, over the next few years, instead of giving, maybe a 3.5% pay increase, that becomes 3 or 2.75, and a couple of years of that gets much of the burden ultimately shifted back to the labour force. So that's how we estimated it. I don't think there's much disagreement amongst most economists who say labour markets that that's the way to think about it. At the edges, of course, there's a bit of uncertainty with how sensitive is the demand for labour to changes in real wages and all that. Some people would put the share that hits real wages at a bit above 75%. Some people put it a bit beneath it. We think ours is a central estimate.
Yeah, so I appreciate those are the established ways of thinking about it. We've also talked about some sort of unprecedented challenges that the economy is facing. We talked about the level of economic inactivity being really high, and we've spoken about some of the reasons that might be driving that, in particular relation to health. We've also talked about the uncertainty of the data we're getting back about the labour market as well. Yep. So I guess I put the challenge again about how did you test those assumptions? How certain are you about this elasticity of labour demand?
There's quite a big, very boring academic literature on these elasticities. I wouldn't wish it on anybody. We read lots of it.
As a man, he says, not bitterly.
And I think I'm confident that the numbers we used are a central estimate based on a lot of studies. You can certainly find some studies that would have said 75% pushed onto labour is too high a number, and it might be 60, 65. There's some other studies which say it should more or less all go onto labour ultimately, and they take 100% of the hit. So is there uncertainty about it? Inevitably, yes. I am fairly confident that our estimate is at least central based on hundreds of boring studies.
Professor Miles, thank you, Chair. As a follow-up to that, when you say your estimate is central, do you mean that you've picked the middle of the range? I see that you've described a range of 0.15 to 0.75 in the elasticity of demand for labour. Is that just choosing the middle point because it seems like a reasonable middle point? Because there is a spectrum of 5 times in that.
Sure. No. Sorry. The overall impact, what we think is 75-25. The range of uncertainty about that is a lot less. I would say that the low end is like 60%, at the high end it's definitely 100%. A lot of people think that ultimately it all flows through to lower real wages. So that spread is 60% say at the low end, 100% at the high end.
Mr. Dean.
Yes, and can I move on also to who this is likely to impact the most? We've got a quote here from Alex Baldock, Chief Executive of Currys, who says that this disproportionately hits high employing sectors. And I'm thinking of sort of pubs, shops, restaurants, care homes, places that employ a relatively high number of relatively low paid people. Right. Is that assessment correct? Would those be the people most likely to be hurt by this?
Yeah, I mean, on the face of it, that's very plausible because there's a kind of lump sum element because of the 9,000 odd limit before you start paying, the employer pays national insurance, that comes down to 5. That affects almost everybody who's working, almost. The marginal change in the rate, 13.8 to 15, the more people are paid, the more expensive it gets for the employer to pay that. But the lump sum element would suggest that it would have a bigger impact on the proportional cost to an employer of employing someone on low wages than on higher wages. I think, however, there's a bit of an offset to that, which is the national living wage, which, as you will know, went up by is about to go up by 6.7%. That puts a limit to how much employers can offer people lower wages to offset the higher cost to them of paying employer national insurance. So the national living wage, in a sense, puts a ceiling on how much can be passed on to lower paid workers. The overall then question, is this disproportionately going to hit lower paid workers? I think is not entirely obvious. I tend to think that the way in which most employers are most likely to respond to this in the short run is to just take it as a hit. Then, as I said a moment ago, when it comes to what's the pay settlement going to be next year, the year after that, maybe that becomes 3% rather than 3.5%. If that's what happens, and that's more hunch than it is solid forecast, that would tend to suggest that it would be shared across the board. So I think the answer to the question is it's not entirely obvious. I can see some arguments why it disproportionately hits employers who are employing people on lower wages, but I suspect that the national living wage effect offsets some of that, and it's not so clear. It's very disproportionate on lower paid workers.
And obviously, some of these industries are ones that are struggling to recruit the most at the moment. We don't have enough care workers. If you go into any sort of pub or restaurant, you struggle to get the staff. They're always advertising. And so what do you think will be the net effect on those businesses who are already sort of struggling to recruit and now facing these two cost pressures, national minimum wage and national insurance contributions? Do you think it could result in headcount losses or even closures?
Headcount losses relative to a world in which there hadn't been a change in national insurance, yes, and our forecast puts in a £50,000 cut, 50,000 person lower level of employment than would otherwise have been the case. I mean, that's 50,000 is a material number. It's not trivial because as a proportion of a workforce that's 32, 33 million. It's a relatively small proportion, but it's a meaningful number. It's not 500 people. I mean, it's 50,000.
And just one final question about whether or not you did any sort of sector by sector analysis of the impact on this, and if that then had subsequent impacts on your forecasting.
I mean, as you'll appreciate, our focus very much is on the sort of aggregate economy, the aggregate fiscal position. So we tend not to have the resources to do a lot of detailed sectoral analysis, but I think it's almost inevitable. The sectoral distribution will not be entirely even.
Thank you very much. Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Chair. Richard Hughes, you're the Office for Budget Responsibility. Is the new fiscal rule more responsible or less responsible than the previous one?
I would say it's, let me say a few things. I think one is that it is at least at the moment, it's over the same time horizon. So the government's got 5 years to reach its target to balance the current budget and get public sector net financial liabilities, known in the trade as PSNUFL, falling. The government's objective is to bring that forward a few years until it becomes the third year of the forecast and then become rolling. So I think in that sense, it is both targets are more likely to be binding on more meaningful parts of our forecast than some previous fiscal targets have been. I think one of the most important elements there is the fact that if you get a better alignment between the deadline of the target and the deadline for spending reviews, that just gives us and you more confidence that when the government says, this is my objective for the current balance and for PSNUFL, it's supported by a detailed plan for public spending, because we have all known that one of the ways in which governments have met the letter of their fiscal targets has been to have a profile for public spending which looks very tight, is unsupported by a detailed plan, and then when it comes time to do those detailed plans, tends to get revised up. So I think in that sense, the time horizon gives us more confidence as forecasted that there's a plan to actually deliver those targets by the deadline. I think the issue is, one thing that we've removed from the fiscal framework is a pure definition of government debt. We are now netting off financial assets and financial liabilities against that.
About those, because my understanding is that one of the financial assets that's now in the public sector net financial liabilities is the student loan book. And is the student loan book in there at nominal value or at mark-to-market value?
Tom might want to say more, but it's all of the loans that are now included on the asset side of net financial liabilities. We apply a sort of case-by-case treatment to them depending on the nature of the loans and our own assessment of their likely performance. So where we think there is a probability of non-repayment, we will factor that into our evaluation of those loans in the forecast. Student loans, because by design there is a strong likelihood of non-repayment to quite a lot of them, they have a very particular accounting treatment.
So can you just help us with that? So yesterday there was an increase announced in the student loan required to go to university. How much would an extra £100 show up as in public sector net financial liabilities?
So that change, that announcement, I should say, to increase student loans in line with RPI is actually what we were assuming in the forecast. So it won't actually change. It won't change our forecast. But in terms of increases in student loans, as Richard says, in that case, there's a well-established methodology that the Office for National Statistics uses to take account of the fact that a proportion of the loans will not be repaid, and that is what is included in our numbers. I think it's roughly 50 to 75% assumption is in the numbers.
Okay.
And we're just saying the assumption of how much will be repaid depends on the particular type of student loan that people took out, because there's been different versions.
The point is that it is mark-to-market value in the fiscal rules. So that was what I was trying to get an answer to. Second question is around the pensions system. My understanding is that this new fiscal rule, public sector net financial liabilities, includes the net asset value of, and Meg and I are both, we should declare an interest, the Chair and I are both trustees of the parliamentary pension scheme, and I believe that this fiscal rule includes the net asset value of funded pension schemes. But what about the unfunded public sector liability? Is that in this fiscal rule at all?
So that unfunded pension liabilities are not in this measure, but only only funded pensions, as you say.
How big is the
unfunded pensions liability? We do have a number somewhere, I think. It is quite large. It is included in some other measures of the balance sheet.
But it's not.
If you got them.
It is tens of percentage points of GDP, certainly.
And it's not included in this fiscal rule. Okay. Debt interest accrued on the index-linked, is that included in this fiscal rule? How are you accounting for that in your assessment?
Yeah, that is included in the measures of borrowing and therefore feeds through also to debt. I think this was mentioned earlier that there's been a big increase in the cost of index-linked gilts this year compared to our previous forecast. That is because of higher RPI forecast, and that hits borrowing immediately, although the actual kind of cash costs of that are actually spread over the longer term, but it hits borrowing immediately.
So you're accruing for it rather than having it as a lump sum maturity payment, the way the bond itself works. Okay, that's helpful. And then finally, as this predecessor committee was interested in fuel duty fiction, my understanding is that the 5 pence has been extended for another year to March 2026, but then your numbers assume that ends and that we restart indexing. Is that correct, Mr. Hughes?
So I think in response to an explicit recommendation of this committee, we now produce our fiscal forecast on two bases. One, in line with government stated policy of the freeze for now, but then starting indexation again in the remaining 4 years of the forecast, and one where it's just frozen for the 4 years. One where it's frozen for the 4 years, which would be in line with the decision that every Chancellor's made since 2011. About halves the government's headroom against the current balance, so it takes about £4 or £5 billion off that, just from freezing fuel duty alone.
Thank you,
Very helpful. I just wanted to follow up on one of Dame Harriet's points about the student loan policy changes. Have you normally included an assumption of RPI inflation in your forecast, or is it just for this budget? For the specific impact on student loans. Yes, well, essentially, all, the whole stock of student loans is in our numbers, and we use whatever the kind of policy setting was for each portion of those of the stock of student loans. You were aware of, so this was specifically because of this budget, so you were advised in doing your modelling that this was an announcement. Well, no, it's just that is similar to fuel duty, there are some baseline assumptions in our forecast, and the baseline assumptions for student loans is that they will increase. Okay, so to be clear, you have included that in previous forecasts, the assumption that it would go up even though it hasn't. Yes, and then when it hasn't gone up, we've adjusted the forecast. Okay, so you didn't do anything different this time that you had done before. Yeah. Okay, just to be clear. Thank you. Bobby Dean, MP.
Thank you. Public sector net financial liabilities is obviously an established measure, but I'm not sure how well established it is as a fiscal rule. So have you got other country comparisons? Do others use it? How do we compare to them?
Right. I'm not aware that other countries use that specific measure. It is well established in the UK. It's been around since 2016. It is the case that it's not been obviously a part of the fiscal framework before, which does mean that it has had kind of less scrutiny as a measure, both by ourselves and by the Office of National Statistics who produce it. So we have now agreed with the ONS a work plan which we set out in the book to really ensure that we develop out the methodologies that we use to forecast it, and the ONS further develop the methodologies they use to produce the outturn in response to it becoming part of the fiscal framework.
Okay, but the idea of measuring the government finances as well is obviously novel, and there are other measures as well, public sector net worth, another one that I know that you track. So are there other countries that are adopting kind of slightly more expansive version of fiscal rules, and are we able to learn lessons from them about what we should be monitoring, what this committee should be scrutinising in the coming years?
Yeah, so other countries have used wider measures of the balance sheet previously. New Zealand is one example. They're quite often using sort of different measures. So they use a wider measure. They use something that's close to public sector net worth as part of their fiscal framework. And it is something that international organisations such as the IMF previously recommended doing. I mean, essentially, because it's a wider measure of the balance sheet, it includes more liabilities and assets than the previous measure of public sector net debt. That does have the advantage that it means that governments are more likely to pay attention to those other assets and liabilities and try and ensure that they're managing them effectively. It does also introduce some risk to the forecast because it has these new elements which we need to forecast, and as I said before, some of these elements are ones that we've put a bit less focus on than other areas of our forecast in the past. It also does create some policy incentives that potentially create some risk that we will certainly be watching out for. Essentially, because assets such as loans are in this measure, it potentially creates an incentive for governments to deliver policy through loans and equity injections rather than direct investment. And I mean, the government has set out, as part of the budget, a set of kind of controls in order to try and ensure that that is only done where it's good value for money. But we will also certainly be paying close attention to that and making sure that we do try and assess the value of the assets accurately and robustly and take account of any risk of default and write-downs in our forecast.
Finally, so you've identified some additional risks, potential policy perverse incentives, but how would you respond to the criticism that it's essentially just a bigger number, it's an accounting trick, and that's all that's changed?
Well, I think, as I say, from our perspective, what we are focused on is the implications for the forecast and implications in terms of risk to the forecast. And I think, as I say, there are ways in which it potentially reduces risk because it, as I say, it does incentivise governments to pay closer attention to a wider range of liabilities and assets. But there are also potentially ways in which it increases risk through the policy incentive I described before. I mean, there were sort of similar incentives in the old measure as well. All of these measures sort of create different incentives. So public sector net debt, because it had no assets of that type in it, created an incentive, for example, to sell financial assets, even if that was not good value for money. And one example of that was actually going back to student loans, was selling the student loan book in order to reduce debt, despite the fact that it was not good value for money.
Ewan wants to come.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Joseph, you talk about fiscal illusions in the outlook, and you named the sale of the student loan book for below its marked value as an example. And the government's financial transactions control framework, which aims to stop this kind of behaviour in future, is that a framework that the OBR will be scrutinising and producing reports on as well then in future?
Certainly, yes. So I mean, they've announced a number of different kind of strands to that control framework, which includes trying to ensure that those sorts of that sort of activity only happens through particular institutions that have expertise. It also includes looking at the valuation of those assets and getting independent assessment of that, I think, via the National Audit Office, and having more transparency through producing reports on those assets. And certainly, we will be working very closely with the people that are producing those reports and with the NAO if they have this role, to ensure that the valuations that we include in our forecast we think are robust and accurately reflect the risk. I mean, we've already started to do that. So the National Wealth Fund is an institution where this is relevant, and the government gave more money to the National Wealth Fund at the budget in order for them to, which they use to provide loans to particular projects, and we have incorporated a kind of assumption on the risk that some of those loans will default over time into the forecast.
Thank you very much. Back to Bobby Dean, MP.
Yep. Moving on to investment spending, there wasn't a lot of detail about where the additional capital spend is going, and obviously, given how much of it is front-loaded as well, that's leaving us with lots of questions. In your engagements with the Treasury, did you get better insight about where this sort of near-term capital spending might be going? Did that inform your forecasting?
So a lot of it is going on, a combination of investments in the infrastructure of core public services, so health and education. And then there are also significant investments in energy infrastructure, sort of carbon capture and storage project, and other kinds of energy investments. But as you say, this is for the second half of this year and next year. What we don't know is what does the pipeline look like for the next 5 years, or indeed after that. And so we don't have a lot of visibility about what the government is spending its capital on, and that's one of the reasons why, when we put together our investment framework, in looking about what effect it might have on GDP, we have just applied an average multiplier to the whole lump sum of public investment. Our colleagues at the CBO and others have tried to do something more sophisticated and actually look at the composition of public investment into different kinds of projects and apply different kinds of returns to different kinds of investments, whether it's economic infrastructure or other things. I think both they and we have found that to be very difficult to do, mostly because of the lack of visibility about what government's investment plans actually are. And then you also have the question around, you can plan for one thing, but what you spend your money on is another, as the chair will know from her experiences on the PAC.
The bell always pushes off slightly.
If you want to pause the bell, that's fine. The bell's come over to you.
Yeah, so just thinking about the economy as a whole, and actually just the readiness for this huge injection in the next couple of years of capital spending, whether or not we've got the labour force, the resources, the actual projects ready to go, shovel-ready projects as they were. And so did you factor that into your forecasting as well? Do you have a sort of confidence level about the amount of infrastructure projects that are ready to go?
Part of the assumption that we had around crowding out was around this very fact that if you see a big ramping up of public spending, that's going to put pressure on labour force, it's going to put pressure on access to materials to do construction projects. And so that was one of the things which informed the overall macro judgment we made about the impact of the set of fiscal decisions made in this budget, which was, as we discussed at the start of this session, are the resources readily available to actually respond to the demands being put on them, in terms of skilled personnel to do the building, access to materials to build the things. And part of the reason why we've got inflation going up and we've got interest rates going up a bit is because we think the short answer to that is no.
And just one final follow-up question. Is there a fear then that perhaps this could drive up the cost of some of these projects if that's what's going to happen in the short run? So instead of spreading that capital spend out over the forecast period, by front-loading it, we might actually end up with more expensive infrastructure delivery.
Quite possibly, yes. And we do have a higher inflation in our forecast as a result of the fact that there's a big fiscal loosening in this budget. About 2/3 of it is going on current spending, but about 1/3 of it is going on capital, which makes it more capital heavy than the overall composition of public spending. So it's a significant injection.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. I just taking a step back and just to round off this bit. I just wondered if you could explain at a high level how this current government's approach to investment spending differs from what's gone before.
I think that might be more of a question for the government. I suppose. What I might say is that, as I said at the beginning, we've got a year and a half's worth of plan here. So that doesn't look that different from what we've had up until recently from the previous government, which is quite a short time horizon. Now, the government has plans for doing a full multi-year spending review next year. They have stated their ambition to provide actually a 10-year pipeline of investments, which I think the previous government had also done on some occasions, and you have to give previous governments some credit for the fact that they also had a pandemic and an energy crisis to deal with. So those plans didn't survive contact with what turned out to be reality. So, but the government has an ambition to provide more detail about its investment plans and their composition, which we will have a further look at. But for the moment, we've assumed a sort of general multiplier on those sorts of things. I think, as Tom was saying, There's an open question for us about sort of what choice of vehicle they use to do the investment. And one of the things which concerns us and we will be keeping an eye on is, does the new fiscal framework create an incentive to channel investments into the form of loans and equity injections rather than direct investment, even if that's a less value for money or even that's a less value for money and more risky way of going about doing the investment. And the Chancellor has announced a set of guardrails which she wants to put in place to make sure that those investments are well managed. We will come to our own view about what we think the ultimate value of those investments is likely to be and what the risks are and whether those guardrails are working. So I think that's an area of heightened risk around the new framework, which we will need to make sure we're doing our part to assess.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rigby. Chris Coughlin, MP.
If I could just pick up on a point that both Bobby Dean made and also Dr. Sander. So I was really curious in your answer around the difference between, say, I guess the Inflation Reduction Act in the US and fiscal loosening in the US and what's happening in this budget. Because as Dr. Sanders said, that did see a payoff in a relatively short period of time flowing through to GDP as you saw that in the US after the financial crash. We're not seeing that in these forecasts. And I was very interested that you have looked in detail at the difference between the US and here. So my question is what's driving that in your forecasts mainly the lack of visibility around what that public investment actually is, what you said, or is it on what the quality of the public sector investment is? And what I mean by that is, we all know that the NHS is in a desperate state, and we need to get these waiting lists down. So there's a public policy imperative to do that. But from an economic growth point of view, as you rightly said, actually a lot of these people wouldn't be in work anyway on these waiting lists, so it wouldn't have that much impact. Economists such as Paolo Sirocco have said that the best way the government can improve productivity with public sector investment is through multi-mission targeted, very specific targeted R&D. And that actually crowds in private sector investment. There's hardly any of that, as far as I'm aware, in this budget. There's a lot of current spending. So is that what's driving the difference versus the US, or is it just a lack of visibility?
Let me say a few things. One is that, look, we've got growth going from 1.1 this year to 2 next year, and the UK economy doesn't often post a 2 in the recent past. And so we do think that there is an economic impact of the fiscal decisions made in this forecast. About half of that better growth performance next year is coming from the fact that there is a net fiscal injection coming from the government going into the economy. The biggest demand multipliers we have come from public investment, the same way it does in the US. I think it's important not to overstate what the government is doing on public investment in this country. It is holding it flat as a share of GDP compared to this year. So as a share of the economy, the government is doing no more investment in 5 years' time than it is right now. What it's not doing is cutting it down to 1.7, which was the previous government's plan. So this is not a transformation in the level of investment going on in the economy. It's just not being cut back.
But it is one of the largest fiscal loosenings in recent decades.
It is, but 2/3 of that is current spending.
So that's what's really driving it.
If I might add just something, one way we thought about thinking through what is the return on public sector investment is to calculate the average real return on the money spent over the life of an investment project. Yeah. And that number turns out to be, I think, quite high. It's about 9%. But what that is if you take the investment and you calculate how much is the extra GDP you get from now into the very long term and express it as a rate of return on the money you spend up front, it's 9%, and that's 9% real. That's after inflation. That's not very different from an estimate of the real rate of return on investment in the private sector. So it's not. I don't think it's that we've taken a ultra pessimistic view on what you get back from public investment. Yeah. It's more that the time lags are likely to be significant, so you might not see much of a boost to GDP potential in the UK over the next 3 or 4 years. It's a bit difficult to know quite what the time lags are because we don't have much visibility on what type of investment is. You could think of some investments that you spend the money on Monday morning and they have their return on productive potential by Tuesday morning. So if you fill a load of potholes, On the other hand, if you build a new motorway, it could take 10 years to finish it.
Yeah. Okay. Just to follow up on that, so there are choices around where the government can spend this huge fiscal loosening that's happened. They've chosen to spend 2/3 of it on current spending. Gilt yields have gone up by 10 basis points. Am I right in thinking that would indicate to me that we're kind of close to where we can max out the credit card here, i.e. there's potentially a significant opportunity cost to this budget, that the opportunity for the government is therefore reduced in the future to make the kind of more growth-orientated, productivity-enhancing investments, because we can't borrow anymore. Is that fair or not?
You've got fewer choices when you've got 100% of GDP worth of debt compared to 20 or 30, which is what we had at the start of the century. And the interest rate on that, the interest cost on their debt goes straight into the current balance. So even if the net financial liabilities rule is not binding on you and giving you some space, the extra interest costs, that interest cost is current spending, and the government's only got 10 billion to spare on that. So if you're borrowing more, adding to your debt stock, and you're paying interest on that, you can pretty quickly eat into that headroom with extra borrowing. Yes.
One more.
Short, sharp question, Mr. Coughlin. I'm sure you said.
Yeah. So I'm just coming back to my question all the way at the beginning. But if so much, I don't know, is it quarter of government debt that's inflation linked? One, is that normal relative to other countries? Two, that really worries me. And three, what are the options? Well, why was that decision made? I guess that's a question for Treasury. Yeah.
Save some till tomorrow.
Yeah, save it for tomorrow. But how concerned are you by it? Because it seems massively material to me to all of these. And should we be getting out of it, or is it just too expensive to refinance that?
Mr. Joseph, when you're all looking at each other here, no one wants to take that, Mr. Joseph.
We all have different views on this. That's the reason.
Let's hear all of them then.
Mr. Joseph, we'll start with you.
A couple of things. So it is the case that the UK has a higher proportion of index-linked gilts than pretty much any other country, most countries certainly. It is also the case that actually for most of the period in which, and they've been in existence for a long time, so many decades, it is the case that for much of that period, index-linked gilts were relatively good value for money for the exchequer, because investors were willing to pay a premium for that investor protection. And we've got quite a lot of demand for that sort of instrument, essentially from the defined benefit pension schemes. But of course, when you're hit by a big inflation shock, then it has a big cost. It is also the case that the government decided a few years ago to sort of try and reduce its exposure, and that's been happening, I think, for about past 5 years. So the amount of index linkers as a proportion of the stock has been falling a bit.
Thank you very much, Mr. Coughlin. Rachel Blake, MP.
Thank you very much, Chair. We've talked a bit about public spending, and now I want to delve more into the departmental budgets. And we've talked about some particular categories of public spending, and I wanted to focus on the front loading, which you alluded to a few questions ago. So what scope do you believe there is for government to reduce spending in the latter years of the spending review? And I'd be particularly interested to know how you might be anticipating that and how you might be forecasting that.
So it is the case that in this budget the government has added significant resources to the overall departmental expenditure envelope, and most of the extra money announced was to go into Dell. I mean, the issue is that they've added a lot in the first 2 years and not very much in the latter 2 years, such that growth in current departmental spending, known as Resource Dell, is 4.8% real this year, 3.1% next year, and then it goes down to 1.3% over the remainder of the Parliament, which is actually not much above the real growth rate in those resources that you saw in the previous government's plans. Now, obviously, it's growing off a higher base, but nonetheless, when you think about the fact that within that overall Dell envelope, you've got a health service which hasn't grown, so that overall envelope is growing more slowly than our estimate of the economy, which is somewhere between 1.5 and 1 2/3. So that envelope is growing by 1.3. You've got a health service which historically has grown faster than GDP, on average a number above 3, and in this forecast you've got it growing above 4 in the first year, falling to 3 in the second year. So that's already growing twice as fast as the overall envelope of public spending. You've then got commitments in areas like defence, where the government is saying, well, at least we want to meet our NATO 2% target, but actually we've got ambitions to go to 2.5. Well, that's another thing which is going to have to grow faster than GDP. Then you've got overseas aid, for the moment growing in line with GDP, but the government says it wants to get it back up to 0.7. So more and more of the stuff within the envelope is supposed to be growing faster than the envelope. What does that leave for the rest? Well, if you look over the Parliament, the rest of departmental spending grows a little bit in real terms over the Parliament. But if you take the period of the next spending review, which is the period from 2026-27 onwards, remaining government departments are actually seeing a real cut in their budgets of around 1% before you then try and pay for defence going to 2.5 or overseas aid going up to 0.7.
So what I'm concerned about is how realistic those towards the end of the spending review period, how realistic those figures might be, and your assessment of how realistic they might be and how you've come to that assessment.
Well, I think it depends on the choices that governments are prepared to make going into the next spending review, and I think there is no doubt that it sets up quite a challenging envelope for that spending review, and one where governments will have to prioritise between competing pressures on resources. And I think it's a particular challenge when governments are not so much committing to delivering a particular service, but they're just committing to delivering a level of spending. If you deliver, if you commit to increasing spending as a share of GDP, and your overall envelope is going down, that's got a very obvious and clear price tag. And so it limits your scope to actually prioritise within those things. And then on top of that, you've just got a set of pure volume pressures on services which have to be accommodated. And what we show in our longer term projections, looking out 50 years, is that there is no funding solution to dealing with those pressures on public services. If you just meet the cost of demographic change and assume the same unit cost in growth and healthcare spending, public spending just rises and rises and rises up to 60% of GDP, and debt goes to 200 or 300% of GDP. Because if you have a bunch of services where the volume of activity and the cost of activity is always growing faster than the economy, your public sector just grows and grows, and your tax receipts don't, unless you do something quite different from what we have today.
If I might add, it's very, very briefly, if I may. The rate of increase of real spending on department services does slow down very markedly. But I suppose the question is, well, supposing it didn't, what would then happen? Yeah. And what would happen is that government spending as a percentage of GDP would almost certainly be rising, because we think that, and we're at the optimistic end of the spectrum on the growth of the productive potential of the economy. So you'd have government spending, rising and rising and rising relative to GDP, and that means that either the tax take has to keep going up, or you borrow yet more.
I think you've quite effectively highlighted the importance of reform, which we'll obviously be coming onto with the Chancellor. Could you just sketch out volume pressures and explain some of the detail of what you mean by volume pressures?
Sure. I suppose in the health service you just have an ageing society, and you have people living longer, which is obviously good news. But it does mean that they are around longer to be clients of the health service. One of the more worrying trends that we've seen in recent years has been people are living longer, but not necessarily spending more of their years in health and in good health, which means that they are more likely to be need the support of the health service for a longer proportion of their lives. And as the weight of your population moves into older cohorts, that creates challenges and pressures for the health service. I think you've also got the fact that the better and better we get at curing things, the more the next set of things are more difficult and more expensive. And so unit costs in healthcare just tend to rise faster than unit costs in other services, because you are always innovating and you're always trying to cure the next thing that is wrong with us. And so unit cost pressures in the health service are also very high. And then on the other side of the ledger, on the tax side, the flip side of an aging society is a shrinking workforce. And so that means you've got fewer taxpayers supporting more and more people who have left the workforce because they've retired, but they need support from the healthcare system and they need support from adult social care.
I think before I pass to Mr. Glenn, I'll just observe that I think Dell spending, something like 45% of Dell spending is now on health. So day-to-day spending from government departments. So highlight some of the challenges ahead, I think. Mr. Glenn.
I just wanted to ask one question about this productivity issue and productivity savings, because most governments assert in there, I think it's a 2% per department, and stress the rigidity of that. What is your experience about the delivery of that and any optimism bias in that assertion? It does seem intuitively like with AI, different ways of delivering services, that there should be scope for significant transformation of services. Can you say something about how you make an assessment of that and how it affects your forecasting?
Well, it'll be one thing which I think in our enhanced oversight of departmental expenditure that we will be asking, I think, more searching questions about. I think you're right that a 2% efficiency assumption or productivity dividend is a pretty standard thing which has been in place in previous spending reviews, so it's not particularly exceptional, I would say, compared to previous rounds. I think one of the issues and questions that we often ask is, to what extent are these savings actually cashable? Are these things which actually free up resources within a given department in order to meet new pressures elsewhere? Because you can make more productive use of people's time, but if the same people are still there working 9 to 5, then that's not saving. They're providing a better service to people, and that's a good thing. But that's not necessarily alleviating financial pressures on the rest of the service. So, one important question is: are these cashable savings, or are these just productivity improvements in the delivery of a service for a given person? Okay. And I think the more worrying thing when you actually look at the data is that productivity in some services has not been improving; it's actually been falling. And in the health service, that's probably the number one concern.
Again, challenges for tomorrow. And I think we're now moving into our quick fire round, and being led off by Mr. Glenn.
Yeah, so I just wanted to ask about on the tax side of things. Obviously, there's been a lot of controversy around the agricultural property relief, and that will be ongoing. Some of that is outside your realm. But were you asked to do any different scenarios around the threshold changes, and what did they give in terms of projections of different savings?
Well, so we don't. I think we can't talk about any policies that we might have been asked to look at. We only talk about policies that the government has actually announced. So, I mean, I don't know if you want me to.
Well, am I allowed to ask you, if you were asked, if I asked you to put a higher threshold, what would that effect have on revenues? Obviously, it's something that many stakeholders in the industry are looking at in the context of all the other pressures they face. What material impact does that have? And if you're not allowed to answer it, I'm sorry for asking.
So we are only allowed to cost policies that have been announced by the government. So that does restrict what we can say about other policy options. I mean, obviously, if you were to raise the thresholds, then you would get less revenue. But we haven't actually looked at. Will
you be doing any modelling on these long-term taxes, the things that don't kick in? They're not. I mean, obviously, national insurance straight away kicks in. Or once it kicks in, it's revenue coming in. These longer-term changes bring it. It's a much slower process, and you're presumably
you're so that is something actually that we have talked about in the report. Partly because the government has, in the Charter, asked us to look more at the long-term impact of policy. So we talk in there about, in particular, longer-term impacts from the capital tax changes, and the fact that some of the behaviours that those changes will provoke are ones that are not likely to be seen over the 5-year forecast, but will appear over the longer term. So, for example, on inheritance tax, the fact that more people, because of the changes, are likely to look to give gifts earlier in life, ahead of the sort of 7-year cut-off before death, is a behavioural change that's likely to happen, but probably won't show up very much in our 5-year forecast. And there are other changes in behaviour. For example, we know that people have used the agricultural property relief as a means of tax planning, and essentially have bought agricultural land on that basis. And again, the change is likely to reduce the incentive to do that. The impact of that on the forecast is probably going to be quite long term and not.
Have you done any distribution? Sorry, have you done any distributional analysis of where that money is from? How many people? You've said, is it 2,000 estates that will yield the 520 million over the forecast?
Yeah, so that is as for the costing of the measure that was announced. the HMRC estimates are that there are around 2,000 estates that currently use this relief. Of that, around a quarter, I think it's around 400, have assets over the £1 million threshold, and therefore would be ones which are caught.
Do you know anything about the baseline? Because it is asserted that 73% won't be in scope of this, but if the baseline is inflated by essentially a house with 3 acres with it isn't actually really a farm, can you say anything about that assessment?
So you mean the increase over the forecast period in the number of estates that might be?
Yeah, what I mean is that it could be seen as misleading, the 73%, because it includes very small holdings that aren't for meaningful purposes actual farms.
Well, for our purposes, what we look at, the data that is relevant for the costing, are estates that use this relief. And so that is what the £2,000...
I think what would be quite interesting when we have you in front of us again is to look at some of your modelling, particularly on behavioural stuff, because I think that's really quite interesting in the context of this budget, but obviously future budgets as well. Thank you very much, Mr. Glenn. Dame Siobhan McDonough.
Thank you. The OBR recosted the March 2024 non-dom reforms and found that they raised twice as much as originally estimated, £10 billion over 25-26 to 2029-2030. As originally estimated. How did that happen?
Well, so the recosting was on the basis of a couple of things. One is that we had new HMRC estimates of essentially the number of non-DOMs in the country based on another year's worth of data. So we essentially got another year's worth of data on that. And that showed that there were more people who would be caught by the reforms than we previously thought. The other factor which changed it was just the fact that a lot of the revenue is driven by global equity prices, global asset prices. And there was a pretty big increase actually in world equity markets between March and the latest forecast. And that, again, just inflated the tax base quite significantly. So I think, it was a big change. We did highlight in March that it was a very uncertain costing, mainly because we were uncertain about, again, the behavioural response that it would provoke. But even the tax base on a measure like that, which is very international, is quite uncertain as well.
What really interests me is that whenever you go to tax wealth, there is always great consternation and very loud noise and concerns that none of these measures will actually make any money and they're merely politically spiteful. And given that the measures in the budget include a tax on, or taxing those people with the broadest shoulders, non-DOMs, capital gains tax, inheritance tax, what can be done to improve the evidence base on this group so we can have more confidence when designing policies about how much they will raise? Is there a way of collecting more data or about making better use of the data the HMRC holds?
It's
a big change, isn't it? 10 billion.
10 billion. I think what is worth saying on that particular change is that most of the revenue that we have scored in the forecast comes from what are called the transitional protections, which is essentially 3 years' worth of lower tax rates that are provided to people who are caught by the new regime. And we assume that population will take use of that offer and essentially bring quite a lot of assets into the UK and pay what is a reduced rate of capital gains, 12 to 15%. So the main yield is a sort of short-term 3-year yield in that window. The kind of steady state impact of the reform is much lower. I think it's 3 or 4 billion per year on an ongoing basis, essentially through the fact that the new regime for people who are not eligible will mean that they are paying more UK tax.
Given that the estimates of how much the non-dom changes would originally have made, are you happy with the evidence that you get from the Treasury on policy measures, and how could they be improved?
Yeah, I mean, generally the information that we get from HMRC is very, I would say thorough and detailed. It is always obviously the case that we can look at ways of improving it. We produce an annual report which looks at the accuracy of our forecasts, both the economy forecast but also the tax and spending forecasts, and sets out a number of different ways in which we think we can improve the forecast. So we had a whole set of recommendations in that report this year, as we do every year, on how we can improve the tax forecast. So we are certainly very keen to do that. Some of that was around trying to find ways to get better information sets on different tax bases. I think on the non-DOMS one, it is more challenging because you are trying to get information on the global assets of this taxpayer population, and there are limited sources of data on that, which is why it is particularly uncertain. It is also the case that changes in the economy can have a big impact on the value of the tax base, which is what we saw between March and our latest forecast. That will likely change again, so these estimates will continue to change over time.
Thank you. Thank you, Dame Shaw. Yuan Yang.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Joseph, following on from that question, you do forecast very large behavioural changes, and in particular very large immigration changes in response to taxes on assets, such as in the private equity industry. There's research from the Centre of the Analysis of Taxation which suggests that those immigration effects are about more than a third lower than what you might model based on UK data. So I want to ask, how confident are you in your estimates of behavioural changes to taxes on assets, and in particular, are those estimates from any UK-based evidence of previous migration impacts?
Yeah, so I mean, certainly acknowledge, as we do in the book, that it is an uncertain assumption. We try and make use of the kind of literature on the impact of tax changes on migration, in particular on that subject. There are actually a limited number of studies looking specifically at the UK. There are more that look at other countries, the US, for example. We did also take into account, but we make use of that information. We did also take into account the impact of the last time the non-dom regime was reformed and what impact that seemed to have on migration. So our estimate in March on the initial reforms was that it would lead to roughly 10 to 20% of the population leaving the UK. We increased that a bit this time just because some of the newer changes increase tax liabilities for that population, in particular the changes to inheritance tax. So we increased those estimates by up to sort of 12 to 25% leaving the country.
Okay, thank you very much. I just wanted to go back to a point that you, in answer to Mr. Hughes, you said that the Treasury did not give you all the information that it should have done under the Act. Can you clarify if, in your view, the Treasury broke the law when preparing the spending forecast it passed to you in preparation for the March budget?
They didn't provide all the information that we require to do our forecast. Now, there is always information that is relevant to the work that we do, which we would like to have. In this case, this was a material amount of information, which would have led to a materially different forecast had we had it. I think every public servant in this country, does their utmost to try and obey the law and respect both its spirit and its letter. I have no doubt that in the preparation of this forecast, the Treasury have been very good and very forthcoming about implementing all the recommendations that we have come up with. There was clearly there was a systemic failure in putting together the last forecast, and and potentially a misunderstanding of expectations on both sides about what needed to be provided.
Right, so it's a systemic failure. It was a material matter. As I would back up Mr. Glenn, that Treasury officials are usually of very high calibre, very good, honest public servants, but they didn't provide you with the information they should have done. What went wrong? Did they break the law?
I think it's a question for the Treasury to ask why was information available within the Treasury and not provided to us. Now, that may have been a misunderstanding of how the law ought to be interpreted. There's no doubt in our minds that had that information been provided, we would have had a materially different judgment about it.
It's a misunderstanding. It's not like the OBR is new. This relationship between the OBR and the Treasury is a well-worn one, as actually helpfully Mr. Glenn got Mr. Josephs to lay out. So what do you think went wrong?
We had a way of working that had worked well up until this particular forecast. It was one which kept the error against our departmental expenditure limits forecast within a few billion from year to year, which is very small. Clearly, pressures had built up, which, based on previous practice, the Treasury would not have disclosed to us, but was material to our forecast this time around. And had we known it, we would have come to a different judgment about the level of public spending. And I should say, the law is, puts a lot of expectations on people to provide lots and lots of information. You always have to make a judgment at different points in time about what is provided. There is no doubt that had we had this information, we would have come to a different judgment.
Given that it was material, are you not just utterly surprised that it wasn't passed on to you?
What we want to make sure is that something like this doesn't happen again, which is why we
have you taken legal advice about whether the Act was broken?
I think what is important to us is that this information gets provided in future and that we have a better system going.
So you haven't taken legal advice, but you're told you've given the Treasury a rap over the knuckles, as you have in writing.
We've taken a good and long hard look at the legal obligations on different parties. We've spelled it out in the front of this report, and I think we are happy now that we've come to a better understanding with the Treasury about what information we need to do our jobs.
Mr. John Glenn.
What concerns me is at the time, given the rhythm of activity was routine, and you'd had no reason to believe that there would be a change in the way that the Treasury officials would interact with you. At the time of that fiscal event in March, April, the OBR never said anything about their concerns over a material change in the dynamic leading up to that event. So what's concerning is that there's a change of government. There's clearly a political advantage from asserting that there's a black hole, but it wasn't substantiated. So you were completely in the dark of that there was a change in the way that they were interacting with you in that previous fiscal event. Is that correct?
I mean, we don't know what we don't know. The Treasury has a large number of public servants managing departmental budgets. We have a handful of people who have to focus their scrutiny and challenge on where we think the biggest risks lie. At the time of the March budget, we had assumed that system was going to continue to work well. It clearly was not. There was material information available inside the Treasury which should have been passed on. Had it been passed on to us, we would have come to a different view about the level of public spending. Now, I'm not saying that we would have said public spending was going to be £22 billion higher. That is not the case. But it would have been materially different had we had that information and we'd have come up with a different view. At the very least, the Treasury was aware of £9.5 billion worth of spending pressure on departmental budgets, which was relevant to a judgment we were making about the level of spending against departmental expenditure.
I mean, I was there until the 12th of November, and I can't...
Sorry, just be clear, 2023.
2023, so I can't account for the interval between that and fiscal event, but all I can see is, having worked with those departmental spending teams week in, week out, I can't see how their demeanour and approach to doing their job would have changed in those 4 months, and I think that's why it's quite confusing that we've got to this situation.
I think there's a lot of questions.
Obviously a big concern which we'll continue to look at. Look, I think thank you very much indeed for coming. In summary, we've heard that the headroom is incredibly fragile, that an interest rate increase of just 0.3% means it's basically gone, that health investment is likely to take a number of years to impact on labour supply, which is obviously a concern and something we may take up with our sister committee, the Health Select Committee. And we've also heard today that there's been an abysmal productivity growth over the last decade, and we do not know whether the package of measures in the budget yet will move that dial. I think it's something that all of us, whatever our party, would hope it would. Obviously, we've heard this concerning issue. The Treasury may have even broken the law in the run-up to the spring budget and not disclosing all public spending information to the OBR, certainly an area for us to probe further. But can I thank our witnesses, Richard Hughes, Tom Josephs and Professor David Miles from the Office for Budget Responsibility very much indeed for their time. Order, order.